September 19, 1944, near Nancy, France. Mist clung to the hedgerows east of Luneville as Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Frey guided his platoon of Panzer IVs into a shallow depression overlooking the road. Orders from the brigade were simple: wait for the American armored column, strike first, and withdraw before artillery found them. Intelligence suggested the enemy relied heavily on Shermans and the lightly armored M10 Wolverine tank destroyer. Frey's men, blooded in Normandy, were confident. Against the 75mm quick 40 of the Panzer IV, the M10's thin plate would not hold. At 0900 hours, shapes emerged from the fog. Through his Zeiss periscope, Frey saw tall hulls, open-topped turrets, silhouettes matching the familiar Wolverine. He ordered his men to hold until the range closed. At 1200 meters, he gave the command, "Feuer." The first round screamed across the mist, striking the glacis of the lead American vehicle. Sparks, dust, and nothing more. A second shot followed, near the turret ring, with the same effect. Frey was about to order correction when a deafening thunderclap answered from the American line. The Panzer IV to his left disintegrated in an instant. Its turret was blown into the air, the hull engulfed in fire. Loader Dieter Kappel, one of the few survivors, later told American interrogators, "The sound was different from anything we had heard, not the sharp crack of a 76. It was a heavy, booming strike. The shell passed through the Panzer as though the armor were cloth." Within 5 minutes, 2 more Panzer IVs were ablaze. Frey's men reversed desperately, firing smoke to mask retreat. Then, to his horror, he watched as a Panther from the supporting company, armored with 80mm of sloped frontal plate considered immune to American weapons at normal ranges, took a direct hit from over 800 meters. The great machine rocked, flames bursting from hatches. Only 2 crewmen escaped. The after-action report of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, preserved in the 13th Corps archives, recorded the encounter clinically. Enemy armor engaged at 0932 HRS, 3 PZKW4 and 1 PZKW5 destroyed by 4 M36 GMC. Range 800 to 1100 yards. Ammunition expended 11 rounds, 90mm APC. These were not M10s at all. They were the new M36 gun motor carriages, Jacksons to the crews, fielding the 90mm M3 gun. Originally designed for anti-aircraft defense, the weapon had been repurposed after ordnance tests showed the 76mm gun inadequate against Panthers and Tigers. Mounted on a Sherman chassis with an open turret, the M36 carried firepower previously unseen in American service. For German crews, the shock was profound. Hauptmann Gerhard Wilde of the 111th Panzer Brigade wrote in his diary, later captured by U.S. forces, "We expected the same weak guns as always. Instead, they pierced our armor frontally at a long distance. Even a Panther was destroyed at 800 meters. This should not be possible. What weapon is this?" At first, officers speculated it must be a British 17-pounder somehow mounted on an American vehicle. Others believed it an experimental piece, too rare to matter. But as reports multiplied across Lorraine that autumn, one fact grew undeniable. The Americans had fielded a new heavy-caliber tank destroyer in significant numbers. Oberleutnant Frey himself, captured months later, recalled bitterly, "We had been told the Americans fought with numbers, never with quality. That morning near Nancy, we learned otherwise. Their gun was stronger than our armor. From the first flash we knew we faced something new and that the balance had shifted." On the fields outside Nancy, amidst the smoking hulks of Panthers and Panzer IVs, a question echoed among stunned survivors. What was this new weapon? The Lorraine encounter did not happen by chance. The M36 Jackson and its formidable 90mm M3 gun were born from a crisis of confidence that had haunted the U.S. Army since the summer of 1943. When American armored forces first faced German Tigers in Tunisia, the shock was severe. The standard 75mm gun on the M4 Sherman could barely scratch the Tiger's frontal armor at ranges beyond 500 meters. Even the later 76mm gun, rushed into service, struggled against the sloped glacis of the Panther. After-action reports from Sicily and Italy repeated the same refrain. American tanks and tank destroyers could win with numbers and maneuver, but not in direct gunnery duels. The problem reached Washington in grim detail. After-action summaries from the Battle of Kasserine Pass, preserved in the U.S. Army Ordnance Department archives, warned, "Against the PZKW-VI Tiger, present U.S. armament is inadequate. Even at close range, 75mm fire fails to penetrate frontal armor. Morale of armored crews is adversely affected." The search for a solution was urgent. The 90mm M1 gun, already in service as an anti-aircraft weapon, offered promise. Its velocity and projectile mass suggested it could match the feared German 88mm. Ballistic trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground in late 1943 confirmed the theory. With the new armor-piercing capped APC ammunition, the 90mm could defeat 120mm of armor at 1,000 yards. Designers moved quickly to adapt the gun to a mobile platform. Early prototypes mounted it on modified Sherman hulls, but weight and recoil made turrets difficult to balance. The final solution, designated the M36 gun motor carriage, used the proven chassis of the M10 Wolverine, but replaced its 3-inch gun with a massive open-topped turret housing the 90mm M3. By spring 1944, the first M36s rolled out of Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal in Michigan. Production was modest. Only 1,300 would be built before war's end, but the timing proved decisive. In September, as Allied armies pressed into France after the breakout from Normandy, the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion became one of the first units to receive them. Captain William C. West, commanding C Company, recalled his men's reaction in a 1985 veterans reunion in Hawaii. "When we saw that barrel, longer than anything we'd handled before, we knew we finally had something that could stand up to a Panther or Tiger. Morale changed overnight. We weren't just hunting, we were equals at last." German interrogations after the war confirm how unexpected this development was. Major Erich Grabner of the 11th Panzer Division told Allied officers in 1945, "We believed the Americans would continue with the 76mm gun, which we could defeat easily. The first time a Panther was destroyed frontally by what we thought was a Wolverine, it was a shock. We had not been told of such a weapon." The 90mm gun was more than just raw penetration. It gave American tank destroyer battalions a psychological edge. Reports from 13th Corps in Lorraine noted a sharp rise in crew confidence. Crews now engage enemy armor at ranges previously avoided. The weapon inspires offensive spirit. Yet the M36 was not perfect. Its open turret left crews vulnerable to artillery and small arms fire, and its Sherman-based chassis could not match the cross-country mobility of German Panthers. But where firepower was concerned, it was the great equalizer. The appearance of the M36 in France was not just an upgrade in hardware, it marked a turning point in doctrine. No longer would American forces rely solely on numbers to overwhelm the Panzer divisions. With the 90mm M3 in their arsenal, they could meet the Wehrmacht head-on in a duel of steel and survive. By the end of September 1944, word of the new tank destroyer spread quickly through German armored units in Lorraine. A weapon once dismissed as impossible had arrived on the battlefield, and with it, the balance of armor combat in the West began to shift. The reports reached Panzer Group West headquarters in drips at first, scattered complaints of Panthers knocked out at unexpected ranges, of Panzer IVs split open in duels they should have won. By late September 1944, the fragments formed a troubling picture. Something new was loose in Lorraine. On September 22nd, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, circulated an intelligence bulletin, later captured by Allied forces and preserved in the U.S. National Archives. The language was cautious but clear. Enemy has introduced a new Panzerjäger with heavy-caliber weapons believed comparable to the British 17-pounder. Reports indicate penetration of Panther frontal armor at 800 meters, identification not yet confirmed. For German crews at the sharp end, the reality was far less theoretical. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Kruger, gunner in a Panther of the 111th Panzer Brigade, survived an engagement south of Ardennes on September 25th. His diary entry, translated by Allied interrogators in 1946, reads, "We saw 3 of what appeared to be the familiar M10 destroyers. They opened fire from a great distance. The first round struck our lead Panther directly in the nose and burned through. Impossible. None of our manuals admit this is possible. Our officers say it must be a new English gun, but the vehicle is American." Such shock spread quickly. Training manuals of the Panzertruppen had long emphasized that American guns, whether the Sherman 75mm or the newer 76mm, could not reliably penetrate the sloped armor of the Panther at range. Crews were taught to close confidently, to use superior optics and armor to dictate battle. Suddenly, that assurance was gone. Captured correspondence between General Leutnant van von Neuwettersheim of the 11th Panzer Division and higher command reveals the confusion. "Our troops report losses to a long-barreled gun mounted on a Sherman chassis, open turret. It fires heavily than the 76. Morale suffers, for men were taught they could trust the Panther front. They now ask, what use is our armor?" At first, many German officers dismissed the reports as exaggeration under the stress of battle. Memories of Normandy colored their view. In June and July 1944, American forces had claimed kills against Tigers that post-battle analysis revealed were often caused by artillery or air attack. Surely this was the same. But intelligence summaries from the Fremde Heere West Department of the German Army confirmed otherwise. Analysts of destroyed American vehicles showed gun tubes of unusual size. Photographs smuggled to Berlin in October identified the weapon, a 90mm cannon. The revelation stunned German analysts. They knew the Americans had excellent industrial capacity, but they had not expected them to field a weapon so close in power to the German 85mm.
88mm Kavalkang 36 and 43 series. A post-war statement by General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of 5th Panzer Army, later admitted, "The sudden appearance of the 90mm gun was a rude shock. We had assumed the enemy would remain technically behind us until war's end. This assumption was false." On the ground, however, theory mattered little. Panzer crews adapted in the only way they could, by avoiding duels unless they held the advantage. Panthers were ordered to close inside 500 meters before engaging, where their 75mm Kavalkang 42 could outpace American reload times. Commanders emphasized ambush and flanking, warning that frontal attacks against American destroyers were now too risky. Still, the damage was done. A report from the 111th Panzer Brigade, compiled after a Rockcourt, recorded, "Enemy gunner confidence is high. They fire accurately at ranges we believed safe. Our men whisper of a new wonder cannon. The psychological effect is grave." Thus, by October 1944, the German High Command faced a new reality. The battlefield edge, once secured by superior armor and firepower, was eroding. The Americans had caught up, faster than anyone in Berlin had thought possible. The rolling fields and hedgerows east of Nancy became the stage for one of the largest armored clashes of the Western campaign. Between September 18 and 29, 1944, the German 5th Panzer Army launched repeated counterattacks to blunt Patton's Third Army advance. At the center of the storm lay Rockcourt, a quiet French farming village that became synonymous with destruction. For the Americans, the battle was a test not only of tactics, but of equipment. The newly arrived M36 tank destroyers of the 703rd and 704th Battalions were thrown directly into the fight, often alongside veteran M10 and Sherman tanks. The difference, as the Germans would discover, was the long black barrel of the 90mm M3 gun. On September 19th, mist rolled over the fields, reducing visibility to mere yards. German Panzer IVs and Panthers pushed forward, confident the fog would mask their advance. But Lieutenant George L. Kobe of the 704th TD Battalion recalled in a debriefing report that his men heard the armor before they saw it. Engines growled through the mist. We couldn't see, but we knew they were coming. When the fog lifted for just a moment, silhouettes appeared. Panthers, broadside, not 300 yards away. Colby's M36 fired first. The 90mm round punched clean through the lead Panther, its turret blasting upward in a shower of sparks. Panic rippled through the German column. As the fog swirled, more Panthers fell, each struck frontally at ranges where American gunners had once been helpless. By midday, the Germans had lost over a dozen tanks in a single thrust. The after-action summary from the 13th Corps recorded laconically: enemy armor destroyed, 19. Own losses, 2. Cause, accurate long-range fire by M36 GMC. To the German crews, the effect was devastating. Unterofficer Klaus Meyer, a Panzer IV driver captured days later, testified, "We believed the fog gave us safety. Instead, they saw us before we saw them. Their new gun fired once, and a Panther was burning. We thought at first it must be artillery. Then we realized it was their tanks." The fighting intensified over the following days. Panthers tried to outflank the American lines, while Panzer IVs probed the villages. Each time, the M36s lay in wait. Their open-top turrets gave excellent visibility, and their guns reached out across the rolling terrain with punishing accuracy. September 25th proved the bloodiest day. German forces massed nearly 80 tanks for a concentrated strike near Jubilees. They advanced in tight formations, expecting to crush the scattered American positions. Instead, concealed tank destroyers and Shermans sprang the trap. Major Charles B. Gates of the 37th Tank Battalion coordinated with the 704th TD Battalion in a textbook ambush. By dusk, more than 40 German tanks littered the fields, many struck cleanly through the glacis by 90mm fire. A U.S. Army Signal Corps photographer captured one image, now preserved in the National World War II Museum, reading simply 90mm at 800 yards. For the Germans, Ardennes was a disaster. In less than 2 weeks, the 5th Panzer Army lost nearly 200 tanks and assault guns. Most were not destroyed by airstrikes, as legend later claimed, but by American tank destroyers and Shermans fighting in close coordination. And among those, the M36 stood out as the weapon that stripped away the last illusions of Panther invincibility. Colonel Bruce Clark, who commanded the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A, later reflected, "The 90mm gun gave us the teeth we'd been lacking. At Ardennes, the Germans came thinking they could roll over us. Instead, we cut them down."
The Battle of Ardennes marked the moment when German armored doctrine, once supreme, cracked under the combined weight of American tactics and new firepower. For the Wehrmacht's Panzertruppen, the era of confident domination was over. By the autumn of 1944, the M36 had already proven its worth in the fields of Lorraine. But to understand why German crews reacted with such shock, one must look closely at the machine itself, its design, its ammunition, and the compromises baked into its hurried production. The M36 gun-motor carriage was not a completely new vehicle. Its foundation lay in the M10 Wolverine, which had entered service in 1942. The M10 used a Sherman chassis fitted with a turret designed for the 3-inch M7 gun. Effective against Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs, the 3-inch weapon was soon outclassed by German armor. By late 1943, American crews knew the Wolverine was inadequate against Panthers and Tigers. The solution was to marry the proven M10 chassis with something far more formidable, the 90mm M3 gun. This was no experimental piece, but a direct descendant of the M1 anti-aircraft gun, itself modeled on the famous German 8.8cm flak. In tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the M3 fired a 24-pound projectile at nearly 2,700 feet per second. Against a flat plate, it could pierce 150 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards. The turret posed the greatest engineering challenge. The 90mm gun was long, heavy, and produced recoil forces the M10's original design had never been meant to absorb. To solve this, ordnance engineers created a new open-top turret with thicker mantlet armor and a wider ring. The open top gave gunners excellent visibility, but exposed them to mortars and small arms fire. Crews quickly learned to improvise, welding on canvas covers or laying spare track over the turret rim. Armament was not limited to the main gun. Each M36 carried a 50 caliber M2 Browning on the turret for anti-aircraft defense and close-range protection. Inside, rocks held 47 rounds of 90mm ammunition. The most common types in Lorraine were the M82 armor-piercing capped round, capable of defeating Panther armor frontally, and the M71 high-explosive shell, used effectively against infantry and fortifications. Ammunition development played a key role. By late 1944, improved HVAP rounds began reaching Europe. These tungsten-cored projectiles could penetrate over 200 millimeters of armor at 500 yards, enough to threaten even the Tiger II. Supply was limited, but where available, HVAP gave the M36 teeth that rivaled the best German weapons. The Jackson's mobility came from the reliable Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine, delivering 500 horsepower. On roads, the 35-ton vehicle could make 30 miles per hour, though cross-country speed was slower. Its range was about 150 miles on full fuel. Compared to the Panther, it was lighter and mechanically more dependable, though its thinner armor, 2.5 inches at the front, made it vulnerable if caught in the open. Survivability rested not on armor thickness, but on doctrine. Tank destroyer battalions were trained to fight from ambush, using speed and concealment to engage before the enemy could respond. The 90mm gun finally gave them the firepower to make this doctrine effective. In after-action interviews, crews described the psychological shift. Sergeant Donald B. Chase of the 703rd TD Battalion told the Stars and Stripes in November 1944, "With the 3-inch, we had to pray for a side shot. With the 90, we don't have to. You see a Panther, you line it up, and you fire. You don't feel like bait anymore. You feel like a hunter." German analysts reached the same conclusion. A 1945 Allied interrogation of Oberst Jochen von Treschow, once attached to Panzergruppe West, recorded his view. The new American destroyer was cleverly designed. It was no Tiger, no heavy machine, but it could kill a Panther. That was all it needed to do. Thus, while the M36 was neither invincible nor perfect, it was precisely what American forces required at the moment of crisis. By combining proven mobility with a gun of true killing power, the Jackson gave U.S. armored forces the weapon they had long lacked. For all its firepower, the M36 Jackson was nothing without the 5 men who crewed it. Each destroyer carried a commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. In the chaos of Lorraine, these crews lived and fought within steel boxes that were at once their weapon and their coffin. Corporal James R. Whitaker of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion described the feeling of climbing into a Jackson for the first time. "It was like sitting under a church bell turned on its side. The barrel stretched forever. You looked down that tube and thought, if this thing fires true, nothing's going to stop it." The gunner bore the heaviest responsibility. Perched behind the M70D telescope, he adjusted range, lead, and elevation in seconds. Private First Class Albert Montoya, a gunner at Aracourt, recalled during a 1962 symposium, "You don't think, you just act. Panther coming up at 900 yards, you put the crosshair just under the hull and squeeze. When the round hit, the whole tank shook, but you knew it was them, not you, taking the worst of it." Beside him, the loader's world was one of frantic rhythm. Each 90mm shell weighed nearly 40 pounds. In combat, loaders heaved shell after shell from the racks, slamming them into the breach until their arms trembled. Sergeant Frank Delgado, loader on an M36 named Texas Bell, wrote in a letter home, "I've never been so tired in my life. You pray the shell seats right, because if you miss even a second, that German gunner isn't missing."
Below, the driver and assistant driver wrestled with the Sherman chassis, grinding gears and fighting mud. They had no weapon beyond a .30 caliber machine gun, and yet their maneuverings often decided life or death. A sharp turn could expose or conceal the broad side of the hull. A stalled engine could doom the crew. Above them all sat the commander, half exposed in the open turret, binoculars scanning for threats. The commander balanced orders, maps, and the lives of his men. Lieutenant Jack Reynolds of the 704th later admitted in a reunion interview, "The worst part wasn't seeing the Germans, it was knowing they could see you. Every time you raised your head, you felt naked, but if you didn't, you'd never spot them before they spotted you. The open turret that gave the Jackson its field of view also left crews vulnerable. Mortar fragments, machine gun fire, even grenades could rain into the fighting compartment. Veterans remembered welding scrap plate overhead or draping canvas to keep out rain and shrapnel, but no improvisation erased the danger. Despite the risks, morale soared when the 90mm gun proved itself. After the first Panther fell to Jackson fire, confidence spread like wildfire. Private Montoya remembered the crew's reaction. "We just sat there, staring at the smoke, and someone said, 'By God, it works.' We weren't running anymore, we were standing." But confidence never erased fear. Tank destroyer units often fought from hastily dug positions, lying in wait while German armor closed the distance. Hours of silence could end in seconds of fire and fury. One gunner later summed it up: "You live in two worlds, the quiet where you pray and the thunder where you don't have time to pray." Letters and oral histories show how these men endured by clinging to small rituals. Some painted names or pin-up girls on their Jacksons. Others kept playing cards tucked into their helmets. Many crews adopted mascots, dogs, cats, even a goat with the 609th TD Battalion. Through it all, the Jackson crews forged a reputation for deadly accuracy and unshakable grit. They were not encased in the heavy armor of a tiger or panther. They survived by training, teamwork, and trust in their weapon. By the close of the Lorraine campaign, veterans of the 703rd and 704th Battalions would say they had finally found the weapon that gave them parity with the Panzer. And inside the steel walls of the M36, they had also found something else, a shared bond, welded as firmly as any armor plate. Dateline: December 17, 1944, near Don-Buetgenbach, Belgium. The snow came down in heavy curtains that morning, muffling the sound of engines and boots, wrapping the Ardennes in a deceptive stillness. At 0700 hours, the forest erupted with the metallic growl of engines and the shriek of artillery shells. German panzers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and Tigers pushed hard through the narrow, ice-clogged roads of Belgium, the vanguard of Hitler's last gamble, Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive. To the green American divisions manning this so-called quiet sector, it seemed impossible that the war could swing back into chaos after the liberation of Paris only months earlier. But the panzers came on relentlessly, spearheaded by Kampfgruppe Piper's armor and the 2nd Panzer Division. In their way were scattered battalions of engineers, infantry, and most crucially, the tank destroyer units that had just begun to receive the newest weapon in the American arsenal, the M36 Jackson, with its 90mm gun. The Germans had expected at best more Shermans and perhaps M10 Wolverines. What they found instead was a weapon that could meet them head-on in the snow-covered villages of the Ardennes. The first clash. On December 17th, a column of Panthers rolled cautiously through a small Belgian village east of St. Vith. The locals had fled, leaving behind shuttered windows and frozen wells. Peering through periscopes, German commanders saw the silhouette of what they assumed were more Shermans or M10s hastily dug in at the far end of the street. A Panther commander barked an order. The 75mm KWK-42 roared, sending a shell smashing into the stone wall of a house. Dust and snow filled the air. But the return fire was not what they expected. A single shot rang out from 900 meters away. It struck the glasses of the lead Panther with a sharp crack, punching through armor that every German crewman had been told was safe from American guns at such a range. Flames licked out of the turret as ammunition cooked off.
The M36 Jacksons of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion had arrived. Camouflaged in whitewash and hidden behind low stone walls, they fired again. Another Panther lurched to a halt, black smoke pouring from the rear deck. German infantry scrambled for cover, shocked by the velocity of these new shells that ripped through armor they thought invulnerable. In the debriefing of Kampfgruppe Piper's survivors, one NCO described the moment. "We thought they were Wolverines, the same open-top destroyers we had faced before, but the shells cut through the front of our Panthers as if it were nothing. At that range, frontally, it was a shock we had not felt since the first time we met the Russian 85. Roadblocks in the snow. The Ardennes offensive soon became a battle of road junctions and frozen villages. For the Americans, time was the key. Hold long enough to reinforcements to arrive. The M36 units were out and
Thrown into this maelstrom piecemeal, plugging gaps wherever panzers threatened to break through. At Bastogne, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion deployed M18 Hellcats, but around St. Vith and Elsenborn Ridge, M36s shouldered the burden. Their crews, many only weeks out of training, learned quickly to exploit the weapon's strengths: long-range firepower, accuracy, and the shock effect of being able to kill Panthers frontally. In one celebrated action near Dom-Buchenbach on December 20th, 3 M36s of the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion held a crossroads against an entire company of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Using the slight rise of ground and pre-registered artillery, they knocked out 6 Panthers in under 20 minutes. German infantry broke and fled into the woods, leaving the snow littered with twisted metal and burning fuel. A sergeant from the 823rd recalled in his after-action report, "The 90 millimeters was the equalizer. For the first time, we didn't have to run. We could hold the ground, knowing that if they showed their noses, we could put a round straight through them." The boys called it the Tiger Killer. Panthers in the fog. On December 23rd, fog rolled across the Schnee Eifel. A German Panzer IV platoon, lost in the white haze, stumbled upon what they thought were abandoned American positions. They pressed forward cautiously. Then came the flash of muzzle fire from the tree line. One Panzer IV burst into flames, struck clean through the side. The Germans attempted to return fire, but their shells vanished into the mist. One by one, they were picked off by M36s firing from 600 to 800 meters. Survivors later testified that the shock was not simply from the losses, but from the realization that these new destroyers could remain hidden and still deal death at ranges where the Panzer IV's 75mm was impotent. A diary fragment recovered from a fallen German officer reads, "These are not the old American guns. They kill us at distances we thought safe. One round and the turret is gone. We cannot tell where they are until it is too late. The men are afraid." The turning of the tide. By late December, as Patton's Third Army swung north to relieve Bastogne, M36s were increasingly concentrated into defensive strongpoints. At the Elsenborn Ridge, they engaged in what amounted to artillery duels with German heavy armor. One Jackson, positioned in a barn, destroyed a Jagdpanther at 1,100 meters, the 90mm shell boring through the casement like paper. German crews began to adapt, sending infantry ahead, trying to lure the Jacksons into close combat where their thin armor made them vulnerable. But American doctrine emphasized ambush, fire, and relocation. M36s would fire a few rounds, then withdraw under cover of artillery. The rhythm of battle shifted. German tanks could no longer simply push forward with impunity. An interrogation of a captured officer from the 2nd Panzer Division in January 1945 summed it up: "We planned our thrusts expecting Shermans and small destroyers. Instead, we found this 90mm gun. It forced us to rethink every kilometer we advanced. Our panzers were no longer kings." Epilogue: The weapon's legacy. The Ardennes marked the high point of the M36 Jackson's wartime service.
In January 1945, as the German offensive collapsed, American units finally went on the counterattack. The Jacksons led many spearheads, their long-barreled guns projecting confidence, even when crews shivered in open turrets under sleet and artillery fire. At a 1985 reunion in Hawaii, veterans of the 703rd and 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalions recalled those freezing days in Belgium. One old tanker raised his glass and said, "We weren't supposed to fight tanks. That was Sherman's job, at least on paper. But in the Bulge, when it came down to it, it was the Jackson that stopped them. That gun gave us the edge, and without it, God knows how far the Panzers would have gone." The M36 Jackson was not perfect. Its armor was thin, its turret open to the elements, its mobility inferior to the Hellcat. But in the winter of 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, it gave American crews something priceless: parity. Against the Panthers and Tigers, they no longer had to rely on flanking shots or desperate ambushes. They could fight head-on. For the German panzer crews, the memory of that shock remained vivid. Diaries, reports, and post-war testimony all echo the same sentiment. The 90mm gun shattered the myth of invulnerability. And when myths die, armies falter. The snow melted in the spring of 1945, revealing wrecks of Panthers and Jacksons alike, scattered across the Ardennes like steel gravestones. But history had been made in those frozen days. The American soldier, once derided as undergunned, now carried a weapon that could look the enemy's best machines in the eye and prevail.